Well, the subject of this afternoon's discussion is what's next for London. And I think we'd all agree that the decision to leave the European Union was one of the biggest gambles of the last few decades. And it was a particularly big gamble for London. The financial services industry is the biggest single industry in the country, yet a lot of the passion behind Brexit was driven by a hostility to London, a hostility to bankers, a hostility to the financial services sector. This is an industry that depends to an extraordinary extent on global talent, on its access to talent. About 11% of the workers come from abroad. We have lots of non-doms living here, working in that sector, and yet Brexit was driven to a significant extent by anxiety about immigration and dislike of a changing composition of the country. So the Prime Minister has a very difficult needle to thread. On the one hand, she has populists who dislike a lot of what London's about. On the other hand, she has 27 European partners who are quite intent on making life quite difficult for us. So it's a difficult future. But if things go wrong for this country and for this industry, the consequences dramatic. A dramatic failure in London would have a huge knock-on effect on the rest of the economy. So the stakes could not be higher here. And to discuss this, we have a very interesting, diverse panel, and I'd like each panelist, first of all, to identify themselves briefly, starting on my far left.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carmen Zechner, and I'm leading the bank structure reform team within group structuring in Deutsche Bank. We assess how, as a bank, we best align ourselves with the changing and evolving regulation that we are facing. As a way of background, I started my career in mergers and acquisitions in Goldman Sachs and then moved into principal investing at Bain Capital and DLJ Merchant Banking, and then originally joined Deutsche Bank to do divestments for them. And it turned out that many of these divestments were actually driven by regulation. And so now, my current role, I define and deliver solutions to address regulatory requirement and changes that the bank is facing, and sometimes they involve divestments or reassessing the business strategy.
My name is Julian Scan. I ran the banking practice for Accenture across Europe and Latin America until very recently. My job there is 28 years in restructuring banks on the engineering side and the operations side across that geography and globally. My second hat is running the fintech program, which is a mentorship lab that we've run for 5 years across New York, London and Hong Kong, which crashes together startups and scale-ups with the major banking and insurance players in each market in an effort to accelerate the adoption of digital and transformative technology.
Good afternoon, I'm Howard Shaw. I like to think of myself as an entrepreneur. Shaw Capital is involved in financial services. It's an investment banking boutique focusing on capital markets and asset management. But I also do direct investment, and a lot of our activity today is in Germany, in real estate and telecoms. So we're today quite focused in the UK and Germany, so I can sort of see the Brexit discussion from both sides of the channel.
Good afternoon, my name is Peter Flint. I work with AECOM. AECOM are one of the world's largest engineering firms, nearly 100,000 staff, 20 billion turnover. We work on infrastructure and buildings across the world. My role at AECOM, I am Chief Executive of Buildings and Places for EMEA, and that brings together all of the skills, architecture, engineering, cost project management for the built environment.
Good afternoon, my name is Nick Candy. I run a company called Candy Capital, and we're involved in the real estate industry, the finance industry, telecoms, mining, and a little bit like Howard, I like to think of myself as a British entrepreneur.
I want to start off by asking a very general question, which is what sort of Brexit are we expecting? Are we expecting a soft Brexit, a hard Brexit, or no Brexit at all, because the European Union manages to fall apart before we can actually leave it? And I wanted to start off with Carmen as a representative of Austria here.
Yes, I think we're moving towards a hard Brexit. That's at least what the Prime Minister is still saying. I know documents have leaked, and we have heard from some ambassadors that there are potentially other discussions, but I think the understanding is it's a hard Brexit, which means, especially for the financial services industry, we'll lose passporting, which will have an effect. I also think that, as we know today, the hearing started at the Supreme Court. We think eventually maybe there will have to be a vote, but we still think that the exit will go ahead and will be faced with a hard exit.
Our view is that it'll be hardish and long.
By long, what do you mean?
Protracted in terms of the actual implications of making the UK stand as it will. That will take the tail of that will take an awful long time.
And what will be the things that will be most difficult for people to decide?
I can only really to decide.
Well, what will make it long? What will be the toughest things?
I apologise then for answering within my industry silo, but that from an FS perspective will be how much of the regulation to recreate and what to build back into our own regulatory structure versus to leave it as we did it before ECB and other bodies took decisions for us.
Okay, your position?
Well, I'm very optimistic. I think that we can get a good solution where we take back our sovereignty, we get recontrol of our borders. I'm sure there will be some kind of special deal for EU immigration in terms of the proportion of EU citizens coming here compared to non-EU citizens, but nevertheless there'll be a control of our immigration policy. I think that we will continue to have access to the market in one form or another. Whether you're a member or you have access, to me, is semantics. And I think the card that we'll play is really twofold. One is that we'll pay money in, we'll continue to pay money in, akin to any kind of settlement in a separation or divorce situation. I think the other card is we haven't really discussed equivalence in these negotiations. People talk about, if we don't have an agreed settlement, there may be tariffs. Well, tariffs are not equivalent to not providing a passport. Not providing a passport is saying, I won't take your services. A tariff is just saying, our goods are going to be more expensive. So I'd put it to everybody in the room, if you were the British public, the British members of government negotiating this deal, would you be framing the discussion in terms of, if you don't allow in our services, we're going to put a price tariff on your goods? Or would you be saying, actually, we might restrict the flow of goods from your country?
But Howard, what are the incentives for the other European countries to give us a generous deal? Surely all of their incentives are to make it more difficult to get out of this union or prison or whatever it is. All of their incentives are to make life really hard for us. Why on earth would you have an optimistic position?
Well, I think you're talking about incentives for the unelected bureaucrats who have an empire that they like to maintain and build in Brussels. The incentives in Europe is that business people want to sell their goods and services to the UK. We all know, everybody in this room knows that we have an export-import imbalance where we have a very substantial trade deficit. But I'd be pretty surprised if you went to the agricultural industry in France and Italy and asked the average wine grower, just a simple question, would you like to do a trade deal with the UK? The only thing stopping you doing a trade deal is Britain wants to control their own borders.
The countries aren't run by wine growers, they're run by politicians.
Well, can I finish? If you ask those people, the only inhibitant to selling your wine is Britain wants to control their own borders. I would hazard a guess that 75 to 80% of the people in those countries will say, well, so what? We want the same. Now, my point is, Europe is going to move in the direction of Britain. Britain won't have to move in the direction of Europe. We saw that in Italy on the weekend. Basically, the population of Europe are saying, I don't like the old set of rules, and I want to reframe and redirect those rules, and the politicians are going to have to react to that, and unfortunately, the bureaucrats in Brussels will suffer the consequences of gradually losing an element of their power.
Peter, hard, soft, or does Europe fall apart before we can leave?
I don't think Europe's going to fall apart. I think they're in for tough times, and I think any election, well, you look around the world, any election at the moment is showing some really unpredictable results. And I think that Europe are in for tough times, but I think they will pull together. I think it's really important from a business perspective, from an economic perspective, that they do, but they might be a little bit more moderate than they have been in the past. You asked, will we exit? Will we not? I think we will. I think the vote referendum and argue about it or whatever, 52% isn't a great majority in anyone's camp, but it is actually it is a vote. It's been held, and there is a statement, and I think it will be an exit, and it's going to take time. The concern at the moment is that from a business perspective, there is so much uncertainty, and political uncertainty is making investment decisions difficult. But go forward 5 years, 10 years, and will London still be a very special place? I believe it is. It is now. It's a truly global city. It's got more headquarters than nearly any other city in the world, apart from Tokyo and New York, I believe. And I think in the future it will still maintain being a very special global city. I think one of the things that I'm quite worried about is the immigration debate, and I think that the incoming resources which are needed to fuel this economy, whether that be on trade or in the professional services, we do not grow enough people in this country to maintain a healthy economy and a healthy growth. So I think that the debate around immigration really needs to be balanced and move forward positively.
Nicholas.
I think we're going to have a softer Brexit than we probably thought when we had the referendum. I think what we're seeing across the Western world is our own Western spring. Not necessarily the people in this room are disillusioned, because probably most people in this room are quite well paid and have a reasonable lifestyle. But I think you're seeing the populists fight back, and they're unhappy. I think in Italy on the weekend they said that wages haven't moved anywhere in 20 years. In fact, the standard of living for the average Italian today is less than it was 20 years ago. And so I think across Western Europe and the Western world, we're having our own Western spring, and it's sometimes difficult for people on this stage to debate it and people in this room to debate it, because we don't feel the pain that some of those other people are feeling across the country.
But isn't the evidence that when you get a populist pushback against the elites dig in? We haven't seen any flexibility from Europe so far.
We haven't seen any flexibility in Europe yet in terms of in the headquarters of Europe. But I think as we see Austria, obviously Carmen, the Austria was slightly the other way this weekend, but Italy, I think you will see more flexibility in Europe. And is this referendum going to go through in the UK? 100%. If we don't let this referendum go through, whether it's through the Supreme Court, whether it's through Parliament, yes, we're affecting democracy. You have to
that seems unlikely.
Yeah, you have to let the democracy work. You have to let the people have their vote. They've had their vote. And I think it will be softer than we think, because Europe will have issues. It may unravel somewhat. It may unravel totally. Whatever happens, if they want to keep Europe together in some state or form, they shall allow the UK to have a softer Brexit than they're suggesting.
I wanted to stick with you to ask the second question, which is, what do you think is the most optimistic scenario emerging from Brexit, and what's the most pessimistic? What's the biggest upside, the biggest downside? What's your biggest worry?
For London?
Yeah, for London. Yeah.
Well, if the financial centre of the world effectively leaves London, that would be very, 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 very bad for London. So we have to find some way of allowing the banks to stay here, whether we give them tax breaks, whether we give them passports for individuals. We have to have the best talent, the brightest talent, the richest people staying in London. We should reverse the non-doms, all these non-doms going to live back in Dubai or Switzerland or whatever. And for the record, I'm not a non-dom, I'm a British citizen. I think we should let people stay. We want the smartest, richest, brightest talent on the planet to come to London. And that's what we need to do to keep London thriving.
And that's possible, you think, despite the populist?
I think it is, yes. I think it is. I mean, there's got to be some political decisions. We're seeing a lot of people come to London at the moment, primarily because of the exchange rate. But imagine the exchange rate wasn't the 20% swing it has been, or 15% swing. Imagine that, the dollar wasn't, the sterling wasn't devalued, and so people couldn't buy things on the cheap. I think we'd have huge problems, especially in our markets, the property market. We'd have a huge problem. One of the things keeping up the property market in London today is because of the value of the sterling being devalued against the dollar and stuff. So
Peter, the same question for you. Biggest upside, biggest possible downside. What keeps you happy? What keeps you worried?
So Nick just touched on one of the short-term benefits, the overseas investment. We're seeing sales and some of our residential projects we're working on going very strongly. We're seeing people acquiring properties from overseas investment. So foreign investment at the moment is saying London, which, as I said, great city, great place to invest in. Short-term problems potentially, lots of confusion, but as a longer-term real estate investment, great place to be. So they are seeing that opportunity. I think the uncertainty, though, poses a real concern. If the political uncertainty continues, and then we start to see banks move, and it could be New York, it could be Dublin. If we start to see that movement, I think a lot of the developers that we've built a large business around in London may start shelving plans, may start stopping projects.
Why do you think you're seeing in the short term these people snapping up these properties?
I think they're taking the advantage. Foreign exchange is down, and they think overall that London's a pretty good bet. I mean, as I say, I think I choose to live here. I wasn't born here. I'm British now. I think London is one of the best cities in the world. The infrastructure which is here to make it great takes decades to build. The cultural centre here takes hundreds of years to build. It's got so many aspects of London which I think make it truly global, and irrespective of the politics and irrespective of what we do, it will maintain a very special city.
Howard, can you think of anything that would give you pause, but make you worried about the future? Brexit-wise, what's the biggest threat that you can think of?
Well, the big opportunity is to deregulate. So the big fear is that we don't deregulate enough. In other words, we don't take full advantage of the opportunity. I totally agree with Nick that we need to make sure we protect financial services and all the other things that we're good at. I would subsidise things like medical and life science research, which, by the way, under EU rules was very difficult because of restrictions on subsidising certain industries. So I would subsidise through tax breaks and grants. I would be looking to encourage software, new media, and I would be encouraging things like the services that we're good at, as well as tourism, which is obviously benefiting from the low pound. Financial services, legal services, media services, all the things we're good at. So I'd try and focus on all the things we're good at, cut red tape, cut regulation. Don't forget, 60% of the private sector workforce in this country are SMEs, and they created 2/3 of all the new jobs over the last 5 to 6 years. 90% of them, over 90% of them, don't trade with Europe. And I know I started, two of us and one assistant, how different it was in the 80s when I started compared to starting an SME today. So what I'd like the government to be doing is encouraging entrepreneurship, encouraging wealth creation. We need to focus on how we grow the cake in this country, and my biggest fear is that we focus on how we redistribute the cake rather than how we grow the cake.
Julian, your biggest worry and your biggest cause of optimism?
My biggest worry is diversion.
Diversion, what does that mean?
Diversion of the agenda. Of all the factors that I think are going to define successful restructuring of FS that is so important to London, Brexit is actually a relatively small part of it. In pretty much every area of financial services, right the way from retail insurance, insurance market as a centre, capital markets, investment management, retail banking, everything needs to go through a huge restructuring driven by things totally outside Brexit. Brexit is one new aspect. If the whole agenda is defined by hard, soft, what do we do, what do we not do, there's a huge diversion of regulatory talent, talent inside large companies, talent in the civil service, that is not creating the environment which we have been doing extraordinarily well at in the UK as a whole for giving visas to people assigned by Tech City to encourage the right skills in, to create sandbox environments, to create arguably the best financial regulator in the world for disruptive technologies. So diversion, I think, is one of the biggest risks. I agree with Howard to an extent that there is an arbitrage advantage of having more control over the regulation. Some of the sledgehammer ways to reduce competition, or increase competition, in the FS market post-207 have caused quite a lot of arguably unnecessary engineering work to be done without value to the consumer. So I agree with that regulatory benefit of having that closer to home. At the same time, assuming that globalization is not going to go into total reverse, the need to be really connected and understanding the thinking from other regulatory bodies is never going to be higher, and it's going to be harder to do if you're not invited to the meeting. So I think diversion is the biggest risk. I don't see a huge risk. Accenture does not see a huge risk on the talent side, but I absolutely qualify that by agreeing with Nick's comments that I'm talking then about the bubble of the privileged in terms of the people who work in the support services, financial services, and the people who work in the banks, because I think any immigration visa environment will allow for that talent to come into the country because we're not stupid. So I don't see that. I do think finally, I mean, we have seen investment decrease, tracking fintech investment. We used to lead Europe by a way in terms of the amount of FDI into this little sector of fintech, which I track very closely. And that in the last 2 quarters has gone down. The US has flattened, and China and other countries have carried on increasing. That is not in itself, that's a lead indicator, but it doesn't mean it's going to be a disaster. At the same time, into our program this year, we had more applications than ever to join the program from a more diverse range of European countries, so mixed signals.
I would add to that I think this diversion is a hugely important issue. All this time that we're spending thinking about Brexit and changes in rules, we're not thinking about other things that really matter, primarily productivity growth in this country, which has been absolutely dismal. We have a huge tail of very unproductive companies. The government was beginning to focus on this. It's an absolutely central issue, and now we will not be giving it anything like the sort of attention that we should have been giving it. So there are big costs involved here. But Carmen, I wanted to ask you a different question, which is, how is this affecting the big financial institutions, the big banks? How are they thinking about it? And what is the chance that they will say, we can go anywhere, we'll just leave here? It's too much of a cost, it's too much of a risk, and we can be in New York, or we can be in Dublin, or we can be in Frankfurt, or even Austria if they should choose to be so perverse.
Yeah. I guess it's currently a period of uncertainty. I think all the banks are watching what's happening. It depends, I guess each bank is sort of in a different situation, but most of them already have actually subsidiaries in EU countries. It's probably only a matter of beefing them up if necessary. But if banks have already subsidiaries, I think most of them are waiting and see what's going to happen before they put any money, which is a scarce resource, or capital rather, these days into the EU. But if there will be a hard Brexit and no passporting, and Britain will decide that certain regulation is not necessary, and then there's no equivalence, then of course some business will eventually have to move to Europe in order to be able to be conducted. So if there is no passporting and the regulatory regime in the UK changes, then the biggest downside is that some jobs will have to move, and then the question is whether all the businesses linked to it, for example, touched upon the fintech industry, will also move. And I think that's sort of the biggest threat to London, which makes it, it is such a vibrant cosmopolitan city, and people come here because of the opportunities. And if it gets more difficult to pursue those opportunities, then they might move to Europe, or they might move to the US also if regulation there gets relaxed, if taxes there are reduced. I think some business might go back to New York.
How mobile is the banking industry? I mean, how much do they depend upon having a network of other people, or are they footloose?
I mean, banks are kind of like to consider these days themselves often as also a technology company. So there is the technological angle, but of course it's also very intensive in terms of human beings working there. And as we know, some of the European cities are not as attractive as London, so I think everyone would prefer to be in London, but if the regulatory regime requires it for certain types of jobs to move, then people will move. And people in finance tend to be very specialized.
Right.
So if someone has been trading all their life derivatives, they're likely to continue to trade derivatives. And if that business has to move because it's euro-denominated, for example, and has to be cleared now in, will be cleared in the euro country, then jobs might be moving.
What are the biggest threats to London? I mean, which other cities, which other centres are looking, salivating over the prospect of us making a terrible mess of Brexit?
I think it's the usual suspects. I mean, Frankfurt has always been trying to compete.
But nobody wants to live there.
But exactly, it's difficult.
Exactly.
I myself moved from Frankfurt. I worked there for Goldman to London. So I think I'm one of those who came to London because it's the vibrant international city. Then there's Dublin, but it's small, but it's close. Maybe people commute from London to Dublin. And I guess Amsterdam, given the Dutch are very fond of the English language, so there are many English speakers there. I think here might have an advantage. And then there's Paris.
I saw the Irish were the quickest off the mark, though. It was about 2 days after the Brexit vote, and the developers were sending mail out to everyone about come to Dublin. So they were quick off the mark.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Well, there was a group this morning which was consisted of many people representing large financial services firms in London, most of which were overseas companies, headquartered overseas, that were very active in London. And I asked the question directly, well, how many staff do you actually think are going to move? And the predominant answer was either none, or we might rejig a few things. 75% of our activities we think we got covered, 25% we might have to think about. The point about equivalence was raised. Even if we don't have access, there's no reason why you couldn't say, if I'm trading in Europe, I'll play by the European rules, but if I'm trading outside of Europe, I trade by different rules. After all, if we sell research into the US, we have to comply with SEC regulation. This doesn't mean when we sell our research in the UK, we have to comply with SEC regulation. So this idea that you should only operate as per all the EU rules just because maybe 2 or 3 or 10% of your business is within the EU is intellectually nonsensical. But I think the practicality is that all the people that were in the room said it's an inconvenience because we have to cater for the worst case scenario. But the practicality is none of them had actually committed to move any jobs, or very few so far.
So far. Julian, what, have you got any worries about people upping and leaving?
I think not hugely, because whilst I think a number of factors could create an asset class to move, and if an asset class moves, it's not about whether the theatres are good.
Like an asset class or a theatre?
If a type of trading moves, so if London, lost its place as a currency centre, that doesn't go, 20%. The world only needs, needs deep, liquidity in the scale market. So you're either number one or you're nothing in some of these, or number 1 or 2. So I think my concern would be, by the time we know it's happening, we won't be able to do anything about it. Right. But I don't think that Brexit is the only, or maybe even the main trigger for whether one of those asset classes will go. I also don't think it's worth strategically treating it as a zero-sum game with other cities. A competition with Frankfurt, or I don't think that's right, because again, around restructuring, it's not just restructuring of the bits that we get our hands dirty on, which is the kind of boring bit at the back end. It's also the innovation and what finance is going to mean in the future. And a lot of banks like Carmen's have, deleveraged to take elements of too high risk products away, and they will be innovating over the next 20 years about how to redefine the role for capital market support companies or commercial lending or whatever you like. And what we need to do is win the battle of how that innovation works.
So you think that London will remain a vibrant fintech sector?
Nothing is
doing stuff.
No, I wouldn't say no. Certainly not. I was talking about broader finance.
Okay.
Fintech's got some specific risks if people are interested in that little niche. And London actually has a weakness point which people don't talk about, which is that the key things you need to be successful at fintech is you need to have a banking market that was really hit for six in 2007, because otherwise there isn't enough stress there to do anything. You need investment coming in, which London has got those things. But to make the Google of the fintech world happen on your patch, it's really helpful to have a couple of 100 million customers who are not tied into existing banking relationships, who are prepared to try a new thing. And that is why China is exploding in what we call front-end fintech, which is customer-facing fintech. And if you talk about a dollar of investment, that is, you place your bets in places where they've got a lot of consumers or a lot of businesses, and there's more churn to get hold of, rather than try and displace another player. But that's a slightly side argument to your debate.
Can I add one thing to that, really, which is the cost of housing? Because I think we're active in Berlin, and one of the things we see in Berlin is so many young people wanting to live and work there and move there. And Berlin's one of the other cities in Europe that people think, I think culturally is a fun lifestyle and can compete with London. But the big difference is the cost of living. So if we want young, smart people to come and live and work in London, we need to address the cost of housing, particularly in these sort of new emerging industries.
Any opinions over here on the big banks, on whether you're going to see them flying away, or are they stuck here?
I think they'll stay, and I think the government should be looking at ways of incentivising them to stay, as well as letting the free markets play themselves. But I would be giving them tax breaks, letting the brightest and the best people stay here under certain visa regulations like you have in the US, and I would make it as viable as possible for these banks to stay here and London retain its status as the financial centre of the world.
And you agree with that?
Yeah, we had a few big schemes towards Canary Wharf go on hold. One in June prior to the vote, and it's come back and it's going faster, and they've actually got more land and it's going bigger. And if you look at those development schemes, we're talking about 12, 14 million square feet of mixed-use development. So that's developers believing that Canary Wharf and this corridor is still ripe for development. It is close to the finance world, it's close to the rest of the city, and if developers are investing that level of money now to take those schemes to planning, that gives you an idea of their confidence that in spite of the politics and the noise and the concern, they believe they've still got very good.
And you haven't heard any of them expressing worries, doubts? I mean, or they're not putting their money there?
Well, they paused. They drew breath. They've changed their product a little bit. They are, you take the residential end, not all aspects of residential are feeling great about the world at the moment. Howard touched on the affordability. London has a very big issue around affordable housing. And
massively.
That was massively there before Brexit. That's still there today. I think the average mortgage was like 4 times salary 15 years ago. It's 11 times in London now. So we know as a large employer, we've got 2,500 staff. A lot of our staff can't afford to live within an hour. Now, yes, the transport links are important. Projects like Crossrail 2 should add to Crossrail 1 and ultimately make London a bigger city. But we've got to get to a point where we're really addressing housing in a bigger way as well. We've got to get like modular solutions. We've got to get faster, cheaper housing. So even post-Brexit, we need to actually address this housing issue. Otherwise, that image of London as that global city continuing to grow will actually, I think the housing crisis could be bigger than the Brexit consideration.
So your worry is not about all these big global companies leaving It's about the continued overheating of this capital city.
Yeah,
What are the solutions to that?
Well, in part, we're sort of hoping that some of the heat comes out of the construction industry. Construction inflation over the last 2 years has been rampant.
Like what levels?
Like last year, over 8%. But it's not so much the fact that inflation's going very high, it's what's happening to the values at the same time. And if values are going higher and faster than construction inflation, no one really minds. But when the construction inflation continues to march on and the values are dropping, then appraisals are starting to hurt.
I think the housing market's it's cooled though. It's not as hot.
Why is it cooled?
I think it's cooled because of Brexit. I think it was cooling before Brexit. I think there was an oversupply versus demand. And demand's increased again since Brexit, primarily because of the low pound.
Right.
Okay? So now we're probably getting more of a balance. But we saw, after 2008, we saw a rise in house prices across London, across the UK, up to a peak in 2014 when they hit a peak. And after 2014, they came off a bit. They probably came off 10%, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. And Brexit has sort of, because of the low pound, has allowed people to come into the market and buy very well. If you are Asian-denominated currency today, or pegged to the US dollar, this has been a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Once in a lifetime, in my opinion.
But you would still agree that in the longer term, London's big problem is affordable housing, getting people to live in this area in a way that's
affordable housing is
affordable and
the problem is the boroughs can't sort it out amongst themselves with planning. Every single borough in London's got various issues, probably apart from the city of Westminster, which is probably the most mature borough and deals with it properly. Every other borough's got issues going on, and we should give more powers to Sadiq Khan and the Mayor of London to deal with it.
What else should we be doing? You talked about modular housing, affordable housing in various ways. I mean, one problem is there's just not enough housing being created compared with the demand for it, isn't it?
There's nowhere near enough housing being created. The price point in a traditional way makes it very expensive, and the speed. I think that things like modularity, this isn't new, it's been there, but not in this country successfully. I think the opportunity is now that we could make that work and actually get some really good modular supply chain at scale operating. Now, one of the issues around modularity is you need to make some decisions and leave it and not play with it. You are talking repetitive, and what you want to do is you want to make sure that the quality of the place that's created in those homes are going to be sustainable over 50, 60 years. What you don't want to be doing is looking back in 10 years' time and saying, oh my God, who created that? That's awful. That looks cheap and nasty. And because if you're going for it as a cheap solution, you'll end up with big social issues, and there won't be the respect, and you'll create rotten boroughs, as it were. But we have the ability to do it well, I believe, and I think that I agree. I think it's very hard for any individual local authority to get their head around this. I think Sadiq Khan needs to really be giving a much greater authority around this, and I think industry should get together. The solutions are there, but no one seems to, at the moment, have the ability to push it over the line.
What about the populist argument? We've got all these houses being bought up by non-doms, foreigners, Asian investors who aren't living there, just keeping it. We need to solve that problem. Do you think that that's going to come from the politicians?
I don't think the problem is as big as the newspapers like to write about it. In terms of investors buying property, they don't want them to sit empty. Yes, they actually want to rent them out. Okay. Or they want to get a yield from them, or they want to see some capital growth. They don't want them just sitting there doing nothing. It's not like a piece of art where you can just leave a property. Unless you maintain it, it devalues actually. Okay. So I think a lot of the Asian investors, a lot of the American investors that are buying are looking at it for a yield, on a yield basis, and I think that will continue while the low pound stays there. But we have to find a way to find affordable housing a better solution.
So we've shifted the argument now from the giant sucking sound of London disappearing because of Brexit to London overheating.
Yeah.
Is that your impression, that we've got to do something about this housing shortage?
Well, definitely. I mentioned that it's the biggest challenge if you want young, talented people to live and work in the city. you've got to make housing more affordable. On the other hand, we have to recognise that we've got a limited amount of space here, and you're only as good as your least good piece of infrastructure, whether that's tube capacity or railway capacity or hospitals, schools. So we also need to make sure that we create hubs outside of London. And, once again, I come back to what are we really great at? We've got 5 of the top scientific institutions in the world sitting in the UK. Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial College,
UCLA. UCL, I mean.
UCL, and Edinburgh.
CLA.
I spent some time in
Edinburgh. And many other great universities, by the way.
Yep.
So I would, other than 2, they're all out of London. So I would be pumping them full of money the people who want to provide venture capital to take those early stage research ideas and translate them into practical solutions which are going to help medical innovation. We're going to help the world with better medical solutions, and we can make a lot of money out of it. So there's lots of things the UK are good at. We just haven't focused on what we're good at and what we're not good at, and put the money into the things that we're good at. And I think this is coming back to the Brexit discussion. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to rethink how we run our economy and focus on the things that we're good at. And part of that will mean that we need to provide support to areas outside of London, not just try and house everybody inside of London.
Also, Howard, once we train these people in these universities, a lot of these students are coming from overseas. We saw it last night in Michael's presentation, that these students are coming to study life sciences at the top universities in the world in the UK. What we don't want them to do is leave with that talent and take it back to America or Asia.
Exactly.
We want them to use it here in the UK to make UK a better place.
Well, I think just a small point on that comes back to the Brexit discussion on immigration. If the government have pressure from the public to set a target on overall immigration, and you have a system where anyone from an EU country can come in without restriction, and you're operating within the framework of a target, it means that you're squeezed on the number of people you can let in from outside the EU. So what happened post 9/11 is that we had this wonderful brain gain because the Americans made it harder for people to get visas to go and study in the US and work in the US. So we got this wonderful talent pool that came to London. Then the government came under pressure to control immigration numbers. David Cameron made the public statement he wanted to control it to 100,000 a year, which of course was preposterously ridiculous in the context of the EU laws, which allow as many people as possible to come in from the EU. So what's the government's response? To restrict the flow of people from outside the EU. It's the exact opposite of what we should be doing. We should actually be allowing people in who we think can contribute to the economy, be it low-skilled people because we need low-skilled labour, or highly trained people who've been to our top academic institutions who we want to retain into the UK.
Well, I wanted to stick with this issue of talent and immigration, because it's obviously at the heart of this. One of the things that drove the Brexit debate and drove the voting for Brexit was worry about the number of immigrants, worry about we're losing our country, worry about the composition of the population, which is something that the government has to take into account. And many people on the Brexit side would like to restrict immigration flows. Now, obviously, London is a very multicultural city, and the financial services sector is something that depends to an extraordinary extent on talent mobility and on foreign talent. Carmen, I wondered if you, again, as a foreigner, could give us some sense of whether you think there is a real problem of London losing its edge, losing its attractiveness, both culturally and in terms of regulations that might come in and damaging this sector.
I think London will remain a centre, also a financial centre, even if certain jobs would have to go in case of no passporting or no equivalence. But people tend to follow jobs. So the question is, after Brexit, what kind of jobs will be created here in London? And as we heard from Howard and from everyone else, and And Nick and Peter, we think that job creation is very important, and a lot of SMEs get created, and so people will want to come, and probably employers will find a visa for them, will apply for a visa for them if the opportunity exists. I think it comes down to that, and that's sort of that's for highly skilled. I guess we haven't really talked about the people in the middle. A lot of people are also working in the middle office or in jobs related to financial services, and the question is whether how those people will get into the country, because visas and to get a visa will also cost employers. Are they willing to spend money to get employment visas for all sorts of employees, or will it be targeted only to the very highly qualified, specialized one, and will we then maybe have a shortage of?
Surely that creates a lot of pressure for back office jobs to be moved abroad. They don't need to be here. Why put them here? It's expensive. It's difficult in terms of regulation. The government doesn't like foreigners. Why not just put them in Dublin or something like that?
I mean, banks have over the last years already done a lot of nearshoring, sort of all over Europe. I think a lot of that has already happened, and maybe will continue to a certain extent. But given the cost pressure that banks have been under since the financial crisis, a lot of jobs have moved already across to Europe, especially on the technology side.
Howard, the same question to you. Why should I, as a young, talented person, want to be in London, run by these awful reactionary Brexiteers, when I could be in liberal Berlin or liberal New York or somewhere like that?
Well, I just challenge that assertion that because you want to control the flow of people coming into a country, that somehow or other it's xenophobic and anti-foreigner. As I made the point earlier, we have limited resources, and the squeeze point has been really not just housing, but access to healthcare, schools. And people feel, I think a large part of the Brexit vote was that they feel that those resources have been squeezed to the point where the services are not good enough, and there's too many people sharing those resources, and it's quite difficult to increase those resources quickly, and that's led to long lead times in appointments to go and see a GP, overcrowding in accident and emergency, overcrowding in schools, shortage of housing, crowded tube trains, all sorts of things. So I don't think you can say that foreigners aren't welcome because of the Brexit vote. What people are saying is, I don't want uncontrolled immigration. I like it to be controlled. I'd like to have a policy. I'd like the government to be in control of it, not reacting to what other people in other countries want to do.
You spoke very eloquently about the wonders of our university system, but about 99% of academics wanted to stay in the EU because they think that their talent is more accessible if you're part of a single market. They think that they get research grants. They think that they want to be part of an open world of learning.
Yeah.
Are they wrong to think that their position as elite universities is threatened by Brexit?
Well, I was fortunate enough to go to Cambridge. I think it was considered an elite university for a few, several hundred years before we were part of the European Union. I also think that there's no reason why we can't continue to give the same research grants or even more. I mean, this is a misnomer, isn't it? There was a fiscal transfer on a gross basis to the EU of over 20 billion a year, and the net is 8 to 10 billion a year. No one's precisely calculated the numbers. There's the difference between the 8 and 10 and 20, 8 to 10 and 20, is the 12 that comes back into the UK, and some of it goes to the agricultural sector, some of it goes in research grants, etc., etc. The government can choose to spend that money on the very same sectors, but at least the government will then be in control of the funds. I'll give you a classic example. We own a housing estate which we actually sold in the summer in Berlin. It's in terms of GDP, it's the largest economy in Europe, and yet we got a grant from the EU to enhance the playgrounds at that housing estate because the local authority in Berlin designated that it was a worthy project and applied for the EU grant. So what they're doing, they're sending 20 billion a year net to the EU, and they're allowing a bureaucrat who's paid 300 grand a year plus to decide
Sure.
whether that money should go back to our housing estate in Berlin. Why shouldn't the local authority spend that money directly? So, you know, the same applies to grants to universities. Why do university professors overwhelmingly vote to remain, I think, is a reflection of the political reality that most people who work in universities have a liberal tendency. There's nothing wrong with that, it's just a statement of fact.
Julian, your view of the talent market and multiculturalism and the rest of it.
My view of the talent market, for the sectors that I know, is as it was. I said at the beginning, we don't see that as a huge threat because of the nature of the jobs will be protected in any visa scheme. I think the societal benefits or damages of immigration are for other people who specialise in that. I must say the report issued by the McKinsey's Institute this morning was very instructive for me, and I would, whatever side you're coming from, I'd recommend everyone have a read of it before you lose the enthusiasm of these meetings. But a couple of comments, Adrian, you said on the point about, is finance mobile in relation to London or not? But I think that question is also very relevant to the regions. There is a very good reason for some ethereal benefit why you want people working in the country you're operating in as a big finance player. Not all of it, but some of it needs to stay here. It's not as simple as India or not. The industry across all sectors has also learned a lot about how to make remote working connect across the financial services value chain because of a lot of people working in other countries in a single flow and support for a customer. And that is then able, Deutsche have, I want to say 5,000 people in Birmingham, I don't know the number, but it's a big number. And they're not the only FS institution. I think JPMC have got 3,000 or 4,000 down in Bournemouth. I believe Hargreaves Lansdown is based in Bristol. And I think that an opportunity of the tech disruption is to expand and get out of the London area for a lot of this strength of the financial services business. Someone's going to have to explain to me why the northern, why we're building the railway from London up rather than the north down on that project. But I think tech can do something.
I'd love to get some questions from the audience. If you could signal that you'd like to ask a question. Anybody? Excellent. Over here, please.
We've focused a lot on Brexit, and 2016 probably will be the year of Brexit. 2017 is very much going to be France and the elections, Germany the elections, Italy, Spain. Companies don't like volatility. Are we going to sit here next year whinging about what's going on the continent? And are we going to think about moving people back to London?
Well, let's start with Carmen. I mean, surely there is a case that Europe is going to be falling apart in the next couple of years, and the big question will be fighting to keep all these foreign financiers from trying to move to London. Surely France is going to be doomed by the end of this year. Mrs. Le Pen is going to be in charge. Merkel's going to be out. Germany is going to be imploding. Europe surely is going to be burning.
Yeah, I think a lot of Brexiteers think that this was the start, and Europe will crumble. Actually, we just had elections in Austria on Sunday for the president, and it was a clear vote actually in favor of the EU. People voted to stay in the EU, and they feared a Brexit called Exit. They feared another Trump. And so Austria, of course, a small exporting country, values the EU highly. And the fact that Lafarge even said there would be a vote, the defeated party said that's actually to blame. So I think that was just the first election. I think looking at Italy, people say that was sort of a vote for the EU. I would be more cautious about that. I think Italian politics and also how their system works is much more complicated than just to say it's a vote about the EU. I think Austria is a better barometer, especially given that Austria took in as many refugees per head than Germany, and is actually, they stop in Austria before they go to Germany, and many remain. So I think I see the picture for Europe actually much rosier.
You may be right, but nevertheless, if Le Pen wins in France, that's the end of the whole thing. So this conversation was irrelevant. And also, I do see two very long-term problems for Europe. One is that the euro as a currency demands much more centralization of decision-making, and yet the logic of populism is to make that almost impossible. So you have at the heart of Europe a currency that is pretty unstable. And the second is that the logic of free movement is one that creates, in a stagnant economy, growing resentment. And there is no sign that we're getting any growth. So I think in the next 10 years, it wouldn't at all surprise me if either the EU or the euro has severe troubles or even collapses. But we have a question over here.
Hi. I'm thinking one of the best ways to keep the city relevant is to keep the average age down. What are the best ideas that you guys have seen in the affordable development or solutions to that affordable housing problem?
Yeah, great question. Can we...
Want me to kick off? We've been involved in a couple of projects which have actually been built, one in Lewisham, one down in Wimbledon, and it's a collaboration with Richard Rogers, and it is incredibly fast and cheap. It's timber framed, and it's basically built fully in a factory and lifted. And on a good day, if it's laid out properly, in theory, you can put 36 modules in. A one-bed house is one module, and a four-bed is two. And it's never been done to scale, but this is something which I think is the type of thing which our industry can do. If I could live in a Richard Rogers designed house, I would. So I think that 1 year from planning to finish, and a lot cheaper than traditional, I think that gives me a lot of confidence that we've got the ideas, we can make a big difference.
Where are the factories?
They were up in Leeds, but you could build them anywhere.
I've seen an Asian model of it, where you're taking the top 10 best architects in the world, all have done modular homes. The problem with those modular homes is they're very much 1 or 2 levels, and we are short of land here. And so if you're going to do modular probably in London, you need to work out a way of doing it more vertical than horizontal, and that will take longer time. So, but this idea I saw from Asia came from a guy in his 30s.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's it. We'll end on the subject of modular housing. Thank you.